Hello everyone, and welcome to the first recorded lecture of BIO1 online. Today we'll talk about Chapter 1, which is the scientific study of life. So, as you probably know by now, biology is the study of life. And life is everywhere, right? Everywhere we look, there are living things, and all these living things are very diverse. But we're going to talk about how all living things have a lot in common, actually, despite their diversity. And before we even talk about that, what is life? So take a second to try to make a list of characteristics shared by all living organisms on planet Earth. So I'd like you to really pause the video now, take out a blank sheet of paper, and try to come up with a list of characteristics that all living things have, whether it is a single-celled bacteria that you cannot, this bacterium over here cannot be seen without a microscope, right? Or this single-celled paramecium. This is a fungus, this morel mushroom. Here we have a sunflower, a type of plant, and an octopus, a type of animal. So pause here and see what characteristics are shared by all of these living things. So here is a list of things that students in the past have come up with, and these are all very much true. All living things require energy. They all respond to stimuli. They all maintain homeostasis. They evolve and adapt. They grow and develop. Many of them, or most, reproduce. They are all organized, and of course, all living things are made of cells. So this entire lecture will be diving a little deeper into each of these characteristics that are shared by all living things. That's what Chapter 1 is about. What is life? So we said, firstly, all living things are composed of cells. And the cell is the basic unit of structure and function of all living things. And Chapter 3 will talk extensively about the cell and its different parts. Organisms can be either unicellular, meaning they're made of one cell only, or they can be multicellular. So, for example, a human can have up to 40 trillion cells, right? Plants can have hundreds of billions of cells. But if you were to zoom in to each of those individual cells, there's almost a life of its own. So there's a lot that goes on in each of these microscopic cells. And there's a video that does a really nice job of showing what goes on inside a typical cell. So the links are in the PowerPoint, but I wanted to show you, these are some of the cytoskeletal proteins inside of each of your cells that give your cells structure and support. I'll talk a lot about that in Chapter 3. These are like the bones of your cells, and they're constantly moving. We're going to see also that cells need to transport materials from one place to another. And there are these machines that walk on these microtubules. And you'll see right now, these microtubules can also get destroyed. So this is that machine I was talking about called a motor protein. This is kinesin specifically. And these guys are actively walking around inside each of your trillions of cells right now. And they walk around to carry materials. And you have different organelles inside each of your cells. You can see this is going to be the nucleus where RNA leaves, so proteins could be translated from them. So you could please take the time to watch the rest of this video. It's very interesting, and there's a narrated version as well. But all living things are made of cells. That's the first thing, right? The second thing is that life requires balance. And all living things maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is the maintenance of internal conditions within certain boundaries. So in other words, homeostasis is like a biological balance. It's internal constancy. So all living things require the ability to maintain internal constancy. All living things must be able to respond to changes in the environment. And this can be conscious responses or unconscious responses. And there's a very apropos quote that everything exists in a delicate balance, all living things. And I promise you that you've heard this quote when you were very young, probably. And it was said by, actually, Mufasa in The Lion King. So it's a very true statement that everything exists in a delicate balance. all living things require homeostasis, and all living things require a balance within each other. So all living things require homeostasis to keep a biological balance. So homeostasis is the process by which a cell or an organism maintains this internal equilibrium. And a really good analogy for how life maintains this internal constancy is a thermostat. So a thermostat is very much like our brain, and it can detect a change in the environment and then enact a response. So for example, what a thermostat is responsible for is keeping the room at a comfortable temperature. If the room is too warm, that is a stimulus that's going to tell this sensor, this thermostat, to turn off. Right? If the room is too warm, we don't want the thermostat to keep the heater on. So the heat is going to turn the heater off, the room will cool down, and then the room temperature will be restored. If the room gets too cold, again, that sensor, the thermostat, will be activated to turn the heater on. The room will then warm up again to the comfortable room temperature. So the brain, just like the thermostat, can respond to any changes in temperature in the environment and will adjust to maintain a balance. But is the thermostat alive? Right, the answer is no. Very simply, it's not made of cells, so you could say it's not alive. But humans have an internal thermostat that help maintain thermal regulation, so the temperature inside of our body, and also fluid balance. So when we are very cold, our brains instinctively tell our bodies to shiver, and our muscles shivering generate heat, right? That's an unconscious thing. We don't have to think about shivering when we're cold. Similarly, when we have low blood pressure or we have too much salt in our blood, so to speak, our brain tells us that we're thirsty, and we get the illusion of that we're thirsty. So then we grab a cup of water, and that will in turn restore our water balance and boost our blood pressure. So the same thing happens with sugar balance, nutrients, salt, and water, right? Our brains basically direct us to what we need to do. So moving on with characteristics of life, all living things develop, grow, and must be able to reproduce. And the reproduction part is a little tricky because there's an exception, right? So all living things, all populations need to be able to reproduce, but not every individual in a population needs to be able to reproduce, right? But for a species to survive, right, you need to have some of the members of that species able to reproduce, to pass on the genetic material of that species. An exception to this, you can think about it maybe, you know this example already, would be a mule, which is actually the offspring of a horse and a donkey. So since there are two separate species, a horse and donkey are separate species, they can interestingly mate, but the chromosomes of a mule are unable to basically mate with another. So you can't have a mule mate with another mule. That's, again, a rare exception. But when organisms do reproduce, right, which all organisms have to reproduce, they pass on copies of their genes to the next generation. And genes are made up of DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And DNA is just a molecule that carries genetic information. That's all that DNA is. It's a special molecule that can encode genetic information. Cells use that genetic information contained in DNA to produce proteins. And proteins carry out the actual functions of the cell. They do the work. You can almost think about DNA as the software that encodes for the proteins, which are the hardware. DNA may be stored in a special cellular compartment called the nucleus. So any cell that stores its DNA in the nucleus is called a eukaryote. So this is an important term that I would write down. All eukaryotes are organisms that contain a nucleus. Cells that do not store DNA in the nucleus are called prokaryotes. We'll talk a lot more about that in Chapter 3. We said that organisms reproduce, but reproduction can be asexual or sexual. And in asexual reproduction, only one parent is involved, and the offspring are genetically identical to the parent. So this is basically cloning, right? It's one parent, basically offshoots parts of itself. So this strawberry plant is a parent, but it's making these little runners. These little runners, they're called, these little plantlets, are identical to this plant over here. So asexual reproduction is a great strategy in unchanging environments. When you're pretty certain that things are going to stay the same, why waste the energy of sexual reproduction when you can just make more of the same thing? In sexual reproduction, two parents are involved, and the offspring are genetically different from either parent. So in sexual reproduction, you have a lot more cost and risk involved, a lot more energy is involved in finding a mate, but sexual reproduction is a very successful strategy in changing environments, since the offspring will be unlike either of the parents. So what this means is, let's say there's a drastic change in the environment, and both of the parents are unfit for that environment change. Maybe because of the genes mixing and matching in the offspring might have an advantage to survive in the changing environment. So sexual reproduction has its advantages, and we'll talk a lot more about that in a later chapter when we discuss meiosis. Alright, so the example here is of these two swans that reproduce sexually, and these baby swans are genetically distinct from either of their parents. So most plants and animals reproduce sexually because of the various conditions on Earth that are always fluctuating. And of course, both the strawberry plant and this swan, which is an animal, both started off as a single cell. So all organisms start off as a single cell. Some organisms, like a bacteria, just stay like a single cell. But plants and animals divide, and they specialize into organisms. Right? So both this plant and these animals are multicellular. They can have up to trillions of cells that we can't see individually, but under a microscope we can surely see. So life also requires materials and energy. And energy is the capacity to do work. So energy is required to maintain organization and conduct life-sustaining processes such as chemical reactions. So what this means is we're going to always need a constant source of energy to keep our organization, because the law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics, says that things go from ordered to more disordered. Right? The natural tendency of things is to kind of decay and to get more decomposed. So we constantly need more and more energy in order to maintain that organization, right? Required to just keep up with life. So we need to keep up with keeping our homeostasis intact. In order to keep homeostasis, we need chemical reactions to go perfectly okay, right? If we want our blood pressure to be okay, and we want our receptors to be able to respond, we need our chemical reactions to work properly. So we need energy for chemical reactions. And the sun is the ultimate source of energy for nearly all life on Earth. And we'll talk a lot more about this, of course, but plants, algae, and some bacteria capture energy from the sun and can actually make their own chemical energy. They don't need to eat food. So photosynthesis is a process that converts energy from the sun into chemical energy of carbohydrates. Animals, like humans, have to eat carbohydrates to get energy. But regardless, we need all these chemical reactions to occur properly, and all the chemical reactions in a cell are called metabolism. So your metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions required to live. So energy is required by all living things, but living things obtain energy in different ways. Producers are the ones that do photosynthesis, and they can extract energy and nutrients from the non-living environment like the sun. So a producer can produce its own energy. Since they can produce energy automatically, we call these organisms autotrophs. So producers, also called autotrophs, can make their own food by extracting energy and nutrients from non-living sources. Right? Some bacteria, for example, can actually get chemical energy from rocks. So some organisms don't even rely on the energy from the sun. They can rely on non-living rocks as well. But these organisms are autotrophs, and unfortunately, we cannot relate to them. We are consumers, and we need to eat other organisms in order to get our energy. Unfortunately, we can't get energy from the sun, from a nice suntan, and we can't just eat rocks like some bacteria. But we can eat other organisms that have done photosynthesis, right? We could eat a plant that has been in the sun and has the energy from the sun. Or we can eat a burger which has energy from a cow, right? That has been alive, that has used the energy from the sun to maintain its organization and its nutrients. So regardless, even though we're not a plant, we still depend on photosynthesis, very much so. We are called heterotrophs as opposed to autotrophs. So consumers are heterotrophs, producers are autotrophs. The third category of living things are called decomposers, which are heterotrophs that absorb energy and nutrients from wastes. So these are often like fungi and some bacteria, and they recycle nutrients to the non-living environment. So this is, again, a very important part of this balance of life. So we need to have, once organisms die, we need to break them down into the building blocks of life again. So fungi, like mushrooms, actually form a beautiful ecosystem that we can't even see. And they break down all the decomposing matter into building blocks that can then generate new life. And just to mention, at each step of energy conversion, so as this bug, this consumer, is eating the leaf of this plant, which is a producer, energy is being lost in the form of heat. So heat is always accumulating in the environment, and that's just one of the laws of thermodynamics, is that energy gets converted from one form to another, but this conversion is not very efficient because heat is lost at every step. So here is a rapid response question, and when you see one of these, I want you to pause immediately and read the question and see if you can get the answer, because I'll answer it myself rather quickly. So try to get in the habit of just like pressing pause, press the space bar whenever you see a rapid response question. Give yourself about 30 seconds to read the question and use process of elimination to get the best answer. So pause here. An organism that can synthesize its own energy is called the answer is D, producer. Right. Another characteristic of life that we're going to go into a little more detail about is organization. So all living things are organized. And the levels of biological organization range from an atom at the smallest level to the biosphere at the largest level. So starting from the smallest, we have an atom, which is composed of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Atoms make up molecules. So a molecule has multiple atoms of either the same element or different elements. Molecules then make up organelles. This is not shown in this picture over here, but they make up organelles, which are structures that are found in cells. And cells, this is the first level of life. So molecules are not alive. Organelles are not alive. A cell is alive. So a cell is the first and simplest level of living organization, so to speak. Right? It's the structural and functional unit of all living things. So cells make up tissues. So for example, a nerve cell, like a neuron, joins other neurons and other connective tissue, other neurons to form nerve tissue. So a group of cells that work together is called tissue. So nervous tissue is a bunch of neurons that work together. Right? This plant cell can make up, this leaf tissue. And then together, different tissues together form organs. So for example, the brain is an organ that consists of nervous tissue, but also connective tissue, right? Like fats and collagen. And there's also blood in the brain. So the brain is an organ, just like a leaf is the organ, but it has multiple types of tissue. And again, a tissue has only one type of cell in it. And then finally, organs make up organ systems because they're all connected. So an organ system is composed of several organs working together. Right? And then, of course, you have an organism, which is the actual individual that contains organ systems. So an organism contains organ systems, organ systems contain organs. Organs are composed of tissues. Tissues are made up of cells. Cells contain molecules, and molecules are made up of atoms. That's the whole list of organization. And organization leads to emergent properties. So emergent properties arise at each level of biological organization. And a good example is in memory. So for example, memory is a very complex process, but when you think about it, memory emerges from just brain cells interacting in a certain way. Right? So memory is a very complex function. It's a very complex property that emerges only when smaller things interact in just the right way. So it happens to be that neurons have to connect in the right way and transmit neurotransmitters in the perfect way in order for a brain to have memory or consciousness. So when the components interact, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is a very important lesson because in biology, structure and function are interrelated. Structure determines function, right? Depending on what the structure of a molecule is, or a cell is, or an organism is, it can determine what it can do, what the function is. And of course, if you disrupt the structure, you're going to disrupt the function. So if I were to damage the brain structure, obviously I won't be able to remember many things. But even on a smaller level, if I were to disentangle these interacting brain cells, they would not be able to produce the emergent property of memory. Because structure, right, the neuron's structure determines function. So we left off an organism, right, which is an individual. But it turns out that individuals actually live in groups. They live in populations. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species in the same area. So you could say there's a population of elephants or a population of trees. And then you can have different populations interact in a particular area to form a community. So a community consists of elephants and maybe zebras and the trees and the grass. So a community is a bunch of different populations of organisms interacting together in a particular area. Different communities form the ecosystem. Right? The ecosystem includes the air and the water, right? So all the non-living things as well. And so the ecosystems are found in the biosphere. And the biosphere are all regions of planet Earth that can support living things. So now let's go from the top down. The biosphere, right, it's all regions of Earth that can support life. So the biosphere is composed of different ecosystems, right? And ecosystems consist of communities of different populations of organisms, right? And an organism is consisting of organ systems. Organ systems are made up of organs, which are composed of tissues. Tissues are made up of cells. Cells are made up of organelles, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. So atoms are the smallest or the least inclusive. The biosphere is the largest or the most inclusive. The biosphere includes everything below it. So try to pause here and tell me what comes before here and what comes after here. So this will be on the quiz or the upcoming exam for sure. So make sure you understand how all living things are organized. And here is a cheat sheet that tells you how all living things are organized. And you can pause here for the rapid response question, Which of the following is the smallest? Pause here, and the answer is an atom is the smallest. So here's a really cool figure from the book that shows a kind of Venn diagram of all the biological levels of organization. So atoms, right, are the smallest. So all these levels of organization, of course, include atoms. So molecules include atoms. Organelles include molecules and atoms. Cells include organelles, molecules, and atoms, and so forth. And anything in red is too small to be seen without a microscope. So another characteristic of life is that all organisms over time adapt based on their surroundings. So it might seem really amazing how all organisms become so suited to their environments over time. Right? It seems like there's such diversity of life and every organism is just perfect for its environment. Well, this happened not overnight. It actually took millions of years in many cases. So over time, populations of organisms adapt based on their surroundings. And what adapt means, right, an adaptation is a modification, it's a change that makes that organism better able to function in a certain environment. So an adaptation is always unintentional, but adaptations provide a framework for evolutionary change. And what that means is that there are small, minute changes in biology because of several factors we'll discuss in this class. And certain changes might be more beneficial to an organism in a certain environment. So if a certain change is beneficial to an organism in a certain environment, right, it will then adapt. And evolution, right, is the change in a population of organisms over time to become more suited to the environment through adaptation. So evolution describes how populations change over time to become more suited to their environment by adapting. So again, this is a very complex topic. Evolution is not easy to explain, but I'm going to try my best here. And of course, you have read the book already, so the book hopefully gave you a good background. But evolution doesn't happen in an individual, right? It's the change in a population of organisms over time to become more suited to the environment. So suppose in a population of brown bears, one just happened to have a random change that made it white. So that was an adaptation. And now it just so happens that in the winter, this white bear can camouflage better and will therefore be less huntable by humans. So this little change that was not intentional happened to add some life to this bear, and now this bear can pass on its white fur genes to the next generation of bears. So the theory of evolution explains both the diversity and the unity of life. And again, this is a very tough but important concept to understand. The theory of evolution suggests how all living things descended from a common ancestor. So almost 4 billion years ago, there was the single cell that all living things descended from. Whether you are a jellyfish, a worm, a frog, a mosquito, an elephant, or a human. So evolution is often thought about as descent with modification. We all have common descent. We all come from the same ancestor, but at every step of the way along the millions of years, there were some small changes. The changes that were beneficial were adaptations, right? And those propelled species farther along the evolutionary tree. So the diversity of life exists because over long periods of time, organisms respond to changing environments by developing new adaptations. So because Earth is ever-changing, the conditions of Earth, and because DNA, the instructions that encode life's, DNA are the instructions that encode life's ability to adapt, they're always changing too, right? The instructions are not fixed in stone. It turns out that DNA can mutate. And it's very important for evolution too. So the theory of evolution explains how life is very united because all of us have common features. But also, since the environments change so frequently, it also explains how we have diversity of life. And diversity can be explained by natural selection. So natural selection is something that you've heard about, and I want to make sure that you understand it. So natural selection is a mechanism of evolution that was proposed by two scientists, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. They both came up with this idea at the same time, but only Darwin is really well known for this. And natural selection says that some aspect of nature, right, natural, selects selection. So some aspect of nature selects traits that are more beneficial to be passed on to the next generation. So it's actually nature that selects which modifications are really beneficial to the organism. So natural selection explains how nature defines, or nature sets the stage for what's allowable, right? So to speak, it was like the cold winter environment set the stage for whether a polar bear was more fit, like a white-furred bear, or a brown-furred bear, right? It was nature that decided. So nature selected the white-furred bear, in a way, to survive, and the brown-furred bear was selected against. So in some ways, it's survival of the fittest, right? The polar bear survived, or it could be death of the weakest, right? The brown bear was killed. And natural selection works because populations produce many more offspring than will survive long enough to reproduce. So we overproduce, but only some of our population will be able to be fit enough to reproduce and pass on those genes. And no organism is the same as any other, right? Even twins have genetic variability. And mutations, I said, are very important, and they fuel natural selection. So pause here and think about, how do mutations fuel natural selection? Right? And the answer is, mutations allow for different possibilities. Right? So it gives more options for nature to select from. So the more options you have, the more mutations you have, the more variations and instructions you have. So then again, nature has more to play from. It has more colors to paint from, so to speak. It has more to select from. I also want to mention something about survival of the fittest. It sounds very kind of pessimistic and bleak. And there's this whole idea of there's this struggle for existence. And yes, that is true. There is the struggle for existence. But there's also the idea of cooperation. And that all living things need to have this balance of cooperation to maintain homeostasis and to maintain the right amount of balance and harmony. And this could be also called, instead of the struggle for existence, the snuggle for existence is a term I did not make up, but I really like it. And again, it's a little more optimistic. And it's not like, it's a dog-eat-dog world as Darwin really described. All of us, once we do have the ability to live in this world functionally, we can help each other cooperate, and it's actually in our best interest to cooperate. We are rewarded when we cooperate by our brains, right? It feels good to be kind. So back to adaptation. Enough of the little kindness lesson, even though those are very important. Let's talk about bacteria. And bacteria often show evolution the easiest. So if anybody denies evolution, you could give them an example of bacteria, because they can evolve before your eyes. So bacteria is, first of all, plural. So one bacterium is a singular cell. This population of bacteria has natural genetic variation. So over time, one cell is just naturally going to be different from the others. Right? So genetic variation increases as genes acquire more mutations. So after a random mutation, this red cell happens to have a special gene that has it's different than the green cells. So this red cell is resistant to antibiotics. That means that if I expose this entire population of bacteria to antibiotics, the red cell would still survive. It would not be killed by antibiotics. Right? So antibiotics would kill most of the green cells, but the red cells would still survive, and they would survive long enough to reproduce. This is evolution, right? After multiple generations of antibiotic exposure, we have a completely new population of cells. that are genetically different from this population. Right? So over many populations, these cells have evolved because now they are distinct from this population. So nature, in this case, was almost the antibiotic. The antibiotic exposure was the environment that selected only these red resistant bacteria to survive. So here's another example. You can pause here and take a look at. This again explains how nature overproduces. Every species tends to produce more individuals than can survive, and there is natural variation. So some individuals happen to survive longer and reproduce more than others do, and the traits of those individuals that survive and reproduce will become more common in the population, right? Those will be more adaptable to the environment. So that's a good example to establish in your memory. So there's so many examples of natural selection that you can think about. Here's one more example that I'll give you right now. So I was in the aquarium last year, and I saw a bunch of people crowding around this tank, and I'm like, why is everyone so excited about this kelp? And it turns out it wasn't just kelp. It was actually a Leafy Seadragon, Phycodurus eques. And this Leafy Seadragon must have evolved over millions and millions of years to have this particular, this physical characteristics of the leaf appearance. So, way back when, let's say there were seahorses, and seahorses kept on getting eaten by predators. And it just so happened that one seahorse had a weird freak mutation that had leafy appendages grow from it. Random mutation. It was very weird. The seahorse wasn't very happy about it, but it was able to survive and camouflage in the kelp a lot more than its brothers and sisters. So it actually survived longer than its brothers and sisters, so it survived long enough to spread on its genes to the next generation. So it was able to reproduce and pass on those freakish leafy genes to the next generation. Sure enough, those leafy genes ensured survival for the next generation. So these leafy genes were an adaptation that were beneficial, right? It enabled more camouflage and survival. So sure enough, after many, many years of mating, you could have a new species form. Right? A Leafy Seadragon is completely different than a seahorse. The two cannot intermingle. They can't mate anymore. And this is, again, simplifying a very complicated process. But this is the idea of how nature fuels evolution by natural selection. So evolution explains, again, how all life is similar, but also how life is very diverse. So here's a great summary of the characteristics of life that should be in your notes at this moment. So, since life is so diverse, we need a way to organize it. So taxonomy is the discipline of biology that identifies, names, and classifies organisms according to certain rules. So all organisms are classified in categories, and I'm going to go from the most inclusive category, called domain, to the least inclusive category, called a species. So this is a list of different categories that might be best memorized with a mnemonic. So it goes domains. So all living things belong to one of three domains. Domains consist of kingdoms. Kingdoms consist of phyla. Phyla consist of classes. Classes consist of orders. Orders consist of families. Families consist of genera, which is plural for genus. And genera consist of species. A mnemonic that I learned in high school was, Dear King Philip, called out for good students. So you can think about Dear King Philip called out for good students. Or maybe he liked Greek salad, so he called out for Greek salad. You could come up with anything that will help you retain it for the quizzes. So we said all living things belong to one of three domains of life. So in the tree of life, we have three main branches. The three domains are eukaryotes, so Eukarya. Eukaryotes contain unicellular and multicellular eukaryotes. And remember that eukaryotes are cells that contain a nucleus. right? They contain a nucleus, which is a special compartment for DNA. All plants, animals, fungi are eukaryotes. We then have bacteria is the other domain, is the second domain. These belong to prokaryotes. So prokaryotes do not store DNA in a nucleus. And domain bacteria consists of unicellular prokaryotes that are found almost everywhere on planet Earth. So bacteria can either absorb food, they could photosynthesize food, they could chemosynthesize food, meaning from they can make chemicals from like sulfuric acid, from sulfur in the air. Domain archaea is the third domain of life that are also prokaryotes. So there are also unicellular prokaryotes that live in very extreme environments as well as normal environments. So it was often taught that archaea only live in extreme environments. And that archaea were very much like bacteria, except that they just lived in extreme environments, and that's not true. Archaea have something in common with bacteria in that they're both single-celled, and they don't have a nucleus, so they're both prokaryotes, but otherwise they're very different. And I'll talk to you more about that in a bit, but archaea make proteins more like eukaryotes do. So again, archaea are very different from bacteria. These are very different from eukaryotes. The three domains are very, very different. So within domain Eukarya, we can divide that domain into kingdoms. In fact, protists is composed of many kingdoms. So there are many kingdoms of protists, which include algae, slime molds, protozoans. But this includes like a paramecium shown here, which is a single-celled protozoan. So these are protists. These do contain a nucleus, so we call them eukaryotes, but these are single-celled. They're not very complicated. Moving up in complexity, we have fungi, which like are mushrooms, also molds and yeasts. So these are also eukaryotes. They absorb food, right? These are decomposers. We also have then another kingdom of plants, kingdom Plantae. So we have mosses and ferns, flowering plants, fruits are belonging to kingdom Plantae. And finally, we have kingdom Animalia, which we belong to. So animals go from as simple as a sea sponge to as complex as mammals, like humans or whales or other primates, like chimpanzees. And we have a lot of complex animals. So animals are consumers that have to ingest food. So here's a table of all the levels of classification. So a human belongs to the domain Eukarya. We belong to the kingdom Animalia, or animals. We belong to the phylum Chordata. We are chordates. Right? We have a notochord. We belong to the class of mammals. Right? We are in the order of primates. We belong to the family of hominids, the great apes. We belong to the genus Homo. And we have the species designation of sapiens. So we say that our species is Homo sapiens. You never say that your species is sapiens. You never say that. If you're asked your species, you say you're Homo sapiens, your genus and species. That's called binomial nomenclature. And we'll talk about that in a bit, how we name organisms by binomial nomenclature. But again, you never say the species is sapiens. You say the species is H. sapiens. So about 3.8 billion years ago, the primordial cell, the ancestor of all living things, branched off into bacteria and archaea separately. About 2 billion years into it, we had cells form a nucleus. And again, we have within Eukarya different kingdoms. We have protists, plants, fungi, and animals. Different kingdoms. So you have 3 domains. Within the domain Eukarya, you have multiple kingdoms. And of course, within the kingdoms, right? You think about what's next, right? Then you have phyla, then you have classes, right? And so on and so forth. Like I mentioned before, organisms are universally named according to binomial nomenclature. It's a two-part name like Homo sapiens that's always in Latin. It's always italicized. The first word is always the genus. It's always capitalized specifically. You could also call this the generic name. The second word refers to the species designation. You can also call this the specific name. So the generic name is like Homo. The specific name is sapiens. So it's always, we go generic name, specific name. So Homo sapiens. If you are a fruit fly, you are Drosophila, which is the genus. Melanogaster is the species designation. But you would never say it belongs to the species Melanogaster. You would say this is Drosophila melanogaster. The genus, right, is always capitalized. The specific name is always lowercase. Both are always italicized. Another example is the mouse, Mus musculus. Right, mus is the genus or the generic name. Musculus is the species designation or the specific name. Phycodurus eques was the Leafy Seadragon. Right, goes generic name, specific name. If you want to abbreviate these, we could just take this generic name and capitalize the first letter. So H. sapiens is how you would abbreviate our species. H. sapiens. Z period maize is corn. P period eques is the Leafy Seadragon. Which of the following are eukaryotes? So pause here, and the answer is C. Fungi are eukaryotes. Archaea and bacteria do not have a nucleus. They are prokaryotes. Which of the following do not store DNA in a nucleus? The answer is A. Archaea do not store DNA in a nucleus. They are prokaryotes. The last thing I want to talk about are some of the challenges facing science today, which include some emerging diseases and climate change. This is going to be a very nutshell topic that I'm going to talk a lot more about in coming lectures. You might even have some guest lecturers talk more about these topics as well. So over the past decade, several new diseases have been in the news. So you might have heard of H5N1, also known as avian flu, or H1N1 swine flu. Then we had SARS, then we had MERS, we had an Ebola outbreak, and of course the one that's most recent is SARS-CoV-2, which is a novel coronavirus, very much like SARS and MERS, that is called a global pandemic in 2019. We still have vaccines being researched. And a good question is, where do emerging diseases even come from? It's often, it's again, a multitude of factors, a lot of which we don't know and understand. That's the truth. But we know that new and increased exposure to insects or animals can give us more diseases. Also, globalization, right? Our rapid rate of travel and how we spread and mix and match cultures also just increases the likelihood of a disease. We also change our behaviors frequently, right? Our use of technology can cause different diseases as well. So, for example, Legionnaire's disease is a disease that was transmitted through air conditioning ducts. So only because of a technology exposure was there an emerging disease. And of course, there are pathogens that mutate and change their hosts. So like a coronavirus. So what happened was the coronavirus, we think, had animal origins. We're pretty certain about that. So SARS-CoV-2 may have come from civets, which is an organ, or pangolins, that have come from Chinese markets. And originally, these pangolins might have gotten infected from bats. Again, I'm not an expert on this. We're still learning a lot of information, but it is likely that bats, which naturally, again, have lots of viruses, they're reservoirs for lots of different viruses, they might have spread the virus to pangolins, which are animals that are illegally sold in Chinese markets. And then these pangolins might have spread the virus to humans. There have been a lot of changes now, and it's illegal to sell animals in certain ways that may increase exposure to diseases. So I'd like you to watch this link right now for a brief overview on SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, which is the disease you get from SARS-CoV-2. And we're going to learn a lot more about COVID in the coming lecture. It's very important. Another huge issue is climate change, which describes changes in the normal cycles of the Earth's climate that are attributable to human activities. So, of course, climates change. Ecosystems always change. That's a natural part of life. But when we talk about climate change, we're talking about disruptions to the normal cycles that are due to human activity. And these changes are normally due to an imbalance in the chemical cycling of carbon. So if more carbon is being released than removed, we have a lot of issues. And that's what happens when we burn fossil fuels. Right? When we burn coal and we burn oil, we're increasing carbon dioxide in the environment. Same thing, when we destroy forests, we're removing the ability of trees to use that carbon dioxide, right? And when we have increases in CO2, that causes temperature increases. That's called global warming, right? When the Earth is warming, even by subtle degrees, right? Very, very small degrees can make a huge difference. And these increases in temperature can do things like melt ice caps, which can then have catastrophic effects on other organisms, but also on flooding. You can have ecosystems drastically change just because of subtle effects like the greenhouse effect. Right? The greenhouse effect explains how CO2 in the environment leads to increases in temperature. Almost like a greenhouse keeps the temperature in, it gets hot in a greenhouse. The CO2 in the environment acts like a greenhouse, and it keeps us shielded with heat, keeps the heat contained within our atmosphere. So you can do a lot to prevent climate change. So we can take a second to pause here. I'm not going to take the time to read this for you, but there are things you can definitely do right now to help prevent climate change. And of course, the number one thing is getting educated, understanding what can be done, or else there will be severe consequences for humankind and all other living things. And here's a quick video that overviews some of climate change's issues, some of the issues we face, and what we can do to stop it. So in our next lecture, which is actually recitation, we'll talk about the last part of Chapter 1, which is the scientific method. And that will be the last part of the scientific study of life.